So this month's beginners talk is going to be done by Rob, who is our association chair and has kept bees with Linva, his wife, for many years now. And he's going to talk about the hive and equipment that we use to work the colony. So I'm going to pass over to Rob. So just to say, normally for the practical weekend, this would be a very practical session with Rob. He'd be there with his toolbox and bashing away with the hammer and showing you how to make frames, how to make up your supers, how a roof is made, all that sort of thing. But this is the virtual version of this, which we're very much looking forward to.
This will be nice and short and sweet. I like doing the easy talks, so this should be nothing too taxing tonight. So, as Helen says, my name is Robert Davis, and I've been keeping bees everything for about 15 years. It was a birthday present to my wife, a beekeeping course, and it's sort of taken over our lives since then, really. And we overwintered about 25 colonies. I think it seems, well, in the summer now we've got about 30, just over 30. But one thing about beekeeping, it's made me more aware of other insects as well, and I'm particularly interested in, well, bumblebees, but in particular hoverflies. Have really taken my interest in the last few years. So beekeeping is an avenue into many other sort of insects and pollinators as well. And as Helen says, I have the honour of being chair of Aberystwyth and Beekeepers Association. So I'd love to see you as new members, hopefully in the future when everything gets back to normal. So tonight's talk, then, I'm just going to give you a brief comparison between natural bee sites, nests, and hives, and what we try to maintain in the hives so that we're working with the bees. And then I'm going to mention something called bee space. And if there's one thing tonight I'm going to mention I'd like you to take away is the importance of bee space. I say it's important in beekeeping because it allows you to work with the bees. And then we'll quickly run through the hive parts. There's quite a lot of odd names in beekeeping with different items of equipment. So it can be a bit confusing for a beginner. And then personal equipment, things like a bee suit we'll run through. And some extra equipment you probably need in the first couple of seasons. Because it's worth bearing in mind, it's not just a hive and bees, you need some extra equipment as well. And then finally at the end then we'll touch where you can buy equipment and some of the costs of beekeeping as well. So the honeybee requirements. Generally, this is a picture of a tree with a natural nest in, and this is Anne, is it, I think, possibly. It's certainly some members came across this nest in a tree, and they decided to try and rescue it. I think the tree might have been felled or had come down. But as you can see, it's quite a large nest, and naturally in the wild, bees would try and find a cavity about 30 litres, which is like a large rucksack, if you imagine that, or a small bin. And they need a fair bit of space to expand into. They won't go to a small little hole, because pretty soon they'll fill it and they'll swarm and they'll have to move on. So they're looking for a fairly large space. Something then that's got a small entrance. They need to protect it from predators, like naturally in the wild, it'd be things like bears and things like that would try and get in up the honey. And then they'd also nest quite high up as well, at least a couple of meters, maybe even up to like 10 meters. So this is why they tend to go for your chimney and the like when they're looking for sites. And then when they swarm, when they split and swarm, they naturally as well, they'd go a fair distance away from other colonies, usually over 100 meters. And this is to make sure that there's enough food source around and that they aren't so close to each other that they can spread diseases and stuff between each other. And the reason they have this natural nest sort of, in a small cavity is to maintain the correct environment for rearing brood. Ideally, they're looking to have the nest at a temperature of about 35 degrees C, and the temperature and humidity is kept constant by the workers. This is a brood frame here. Underneath these bees is the cat larvae, the bees developing, and these bees will spend their first few days of their life feeding the young larvae, keeping the larvae warm, and then if it gets too dry, they'll bring water into the hive, and then they'll try and evaporate it off by fanning their wings. And so there's a constant work for these bees to feed the larvae and to maintain the correct temperature. On really cold days, they'll cluster over the larvae. Let's say for the first week or so, that's all they do. They're attending the larvae. So ourselves as beekeepers, we're looking for something slightly different. We're trying to maintain all the correct environment inside the box, inside the hive, but we need hives which have movable boxes. So there's various management techniques we do where we need to split hives. So there's no point just having the hive in one big box, because we wouldn't be able to do that. And then in particular, we need the bees to make their comb on movable frames, because you need to inspect your bees on a regular basis throughout the season, and you can only do that by lifting the frames out. And before the modern hive was developed, people used to keep bees in straw skeps, and there you wouldn't be able to have inspected them at all. And when you came to collect your honey at the end of the season, you'd have to destroy the whole nest. So the modern hive was developed in the mid-1800s by the Reverend Langstroth. And Reverend Langstroth was the person who discovered bee space, and that was the foundation then of developing the modern hive. And the modern hive works with the bees, I say, not to destroy their work like the old skeps, the old straw skeps did. So bee space, as I say, if there's one thing tonight to ask you please to try and remember, is bee space. And Reverend Langstroth measured it, well, discovered it and measured it to be around about 7 millimeters. Oh, bear with me, excuse me a minute, I've got this funny slide. There we go. So naturally in the wild, if you see this photo on the top right, the bees will naturally make a comb, which is like semicircular in shape. But if you were to look at the spacing between each comb, it's actually about 7 millimeters. And this spacing allows the bees to work side by side, back to back. So it's the most efficient spacing that the bees can use to have two frames where they can work back to back, as I say, and lost my train of thought. And then if they had a space smaller than 7 millimeters, they'd fill that then with what we call burr comb, which is small slithers of wax to fill that space. And if it's even smaller, they tend to use something called propolis, which is a substance they get from tree resin. And so in the hive, they'll cover the entire inside the hive with propolis to fill in small cracks and gaps. And also propolis has antiseptic properties as well. So and that's why they line everything in the hive with propolis. And then bigger gaps, then they'll just fill it up with brace comb. So it's very important for us that when we have our frames, if you look at the bottom picture, bottom right, that they have the correct spacing, because you don't want to go to the hive, every time you go to the hive, you don't want to be breaking away brace comb or trying to unstick propolis, propolis is extremely sticky. It's probably better than super glue. Some hives, it's very hard to get things to remove frames and to remove the boxes because they've been stuck down so well. So that's why you make sure that everything has the correct bee space. And unfortunately, in beekeeping, there are many different types of hives, and some have top bee space and some have bottom deep bee space. And that's all I can say is don't worry about if it's top or bottom, but always make sure when you're buying equipment that is of the same type. So always make sure you're buying national equipment if you're on national, or Smith if you're on Smith hives. Don't ask me why, but in beekeeping there's always a myriad of people always trying to reinvent the wheel. Basically, it's a very simple concept, a beehive, and there's no need to reinvent it. And the national hive, which most people use in Wales, is perfectly adequate for what we want. I say normally, as Helen said, we normally do this more as a practical session where we're outside with a complete hive, and it's much easier to describe what bee space is. So when you come to do our, hopefully do our beginners course next year, hopefully once COVID's disappeared, it's much easier to describe in the flesh in front of a hive. So common hives that are used in Wales, most, I say there's different types, but most, by far, by like 90% of the people in Wales tend to use a national hive, which was developed just after the war, and it's the most efficient use of wood, because after the war, wood was in rationing, and it was very important to encourage people to keep bees because sugar was in short supply. So the government developed what we call the national hive, and it became the standard hive then for the majority of the country. But in recent times, there is a choice to be made between wood or polystyrene. Both of these pictures here are national hives. They're all identical in size, and you can interchange boxes from each type. But there's pros and cons between wood and polystyrene, and this is in a talk in itself. But one of the things you really should consider is how you're going to clean and disinfect equipment. And it's very simple with wooden hives. You just blowtorch them. You just get a blowtorch and you just run the blowtorch over the hive, the inside of the hive, taking great care with the corners and any small crevices. And you can do a whole entire hive, maybe 4 boxes and a floor and the roof. It'll probably take you 10 minutes. But unfortunately, you can't use a blowtorch on polystyrene for obvious reasons. So you have to use soda crystals in solution. But what you need to bear in thought is how you're going to do this, because you obviously need some sort of bath or large container to dip your polystyrene hive into. There's some talk as well that some people think polystyrene hives are lighter and easier to use. But when you think about it, when it's full of frames, full of honey, there's very little difference in the hive, really. The percentage difference between a wooden hive and a polystyrene hive when it's full, we've got full frames, is small. And then you need to be careful then with how you are handling the hives as well. Modern polystyrene hives are quite tough, but in my opinion, they're not as tough as wood. But then I started beekeeping with wooden hives, and so maybe I'm a bit biased really towards wood. I know we have some members who have only had polystyrene hives and love them. So before you buy, it might be worth going to see different people's hives and just trying to get as much experience as you can before you buy. So, but I would say stick with national really. Is probably the best hive locally. By having a national hive, if you are as a beginner short of equipment, it's very easy for you then to maybe borrow some. So as I say, in beekeeping, there's quite a lot of strange names for different items. You'll soon pick it up. It's one of these strange, I suppose. It's like any hobby really. People don't use box, this brood chamber or crown board or super. But you say it's quite easy to pick up in a short space of time. So what I generally do now is I would generally take you outside and run through a hive, showing you each piece of equipment. Unfortunately, that's not the case tonight. So I normally start off with hive stands. I normally work from bottom to top. It's much easier. And I would say take some time, if you can, to think about your hive stand. The first thing I'd ask you to consider is the height the stand is going to be off the floor. It's important to keep the hive off the floor because you need to keep it away from dampness and moisture and the undergrowth. And some people use concrete blocks, some people use old pallets, but I don't particularly like them to be too low because you are going to spend, hopefully, if you beekeep to a reasonable standard, you'll be going through your beehives on a weekly basis from middle of April to about now, middle of August. And so when you have a large number of hives, the last thing you want to be doing is being crouched over all day looking through hives. So I always, I designed, these are my own stands, and I designed them so Linda and I are thankfully a similar height. So the top of the brood box, which you never move, hardly ever move away, is at waist height. So we have to do very little bending over when we are picking out frames. But equally, you don't want to go too high, because if you go much higher than that, then when you have 4 or 5 boxes full of honey above the brood box, it's very heavy, and literally you could be on your tiptoes, trying to get boxes off. So it's a balance between not being too low to protect your back and not being too high so that you're lifting boxes, very heavy boxes above your head. I also try and make hive stands, if you imagine 3 hives wide, because then, hopefully you can see my cursor, I think you can, then when you're taking equipment off, you don't have to put it on the floor, you can put it on the stand. So the first thing we do is to take the roof off, put it upside down, and then any other boxes, super boxes like here, full of honey, will go here in the middle, so then we can inspect the brood box then. And then it's by my luck and judgment, and the gap between the 2 rails here just happens to be the right size to hang a frame in as well, because when you take when you're doing inspections, you take 1 frame out and you put it aside. So by putting it here between these 2 rails, it's kept off the ground as well. So I say just bear in mind your hive stands before you start. And then so obviously the first thing then is going to be the floor, and modern floors have mesh flooring, and the mesh flooring is very, very small fine mesh. It's to help ventilation, in particularly in winter. You'll find bees can cope well with the cold as long as they've got enough stores to eat to be able to generate heat and keep warm. They're fine, but what they do struggle with is dampness, and particularly in West Wales it can be very damp. So there's a mesh floor to help ventilation. And then we unfortunately in this country, well, most of the world now, have a parasitic mite called varroa, which live on the bees. And there are various ways of keeping varroa numbers down, and it's very important to keep varroa numbers down. Unfortunately, disease is a really complex topic, and as a beginner, you just need to be aware that there is something called varroa. Over time, you will learn how to deal with it. But the mesh floor is there because the bees naturally groom these varroa mites off, and when they fall down, they will fall through the mesh to the ground below. Whereas if you had a solid floor, they're very likely just to crawl along the floor, up the sides and back onto the bees. So by having a mesh floor, sorry, you will reduce the number of varroa in the hive. And then you have an entrance block, and this block in the front is interchangeable. It's not fixed to the floor at all. And then different times of the year, you'll have different size entrances. This is quite a large entrance for the summer months when they're really busy. And around about now, well, actually last weekend, we changed all our entrance blocks to a very small block. It's a very small entrance, only about 1 centimetre square, because it's about now that that wasps start becoming a nuisance to hives. They'll start trying to enter hives to steal the honey. So by reducing the hive entrance, it allows the bees, the guard bees, then to protect the hives from wasps coming in to steal the honey. And then these are the sort of floors I've designed myself. I'm quite a bit of a handyman, practical person. But floors you buy, some do have this board in front called a landing board. Some don't. I personally think it's quite a good idea to have a landing board, because on windy days in particular, when our bees coming back, it's cropped full of nectar, it can be quite hard for it to land. So by having a large entrance block, what you'll find is it's a bit like an aircraft coming into onto an aircraft carrier. They'll just literally, fall down onto the landing board, and then they'll walk up to the entrance block. And also the landing board as well. There's quite a lot of interactions going on between the bees. And as a beekeeper, it's quite nice to be able to sit down and in front of the hive and just watch what's going on. And I personally think it's easier as well for the guard bees to protect the entrance as well, because quite often we'll notice at a distance there's an unusual bee, and they'll be out and will attack it immediately on the landing board, not at the hive entrance. So it's I quite like having landing boards as well. And then the first box then that it goes on top of the floor is called the brood box, and as the name suggests, it's where the brood, the young larvae, are reared. And it's in this box is where the queen lives as well. So the queen just spends the whole, after she's mated, after she's come back from her mating flight, she'll virtually spend all her life then, apart from when she swarms, in this bottom box where she just lays the eggs. And hopefully by now, maybe if you've seen a few of our talks, you'll be used to seeing a brood frame. This is a brood frame. And in the center here is the larvae. And these larvae in the cells have been capped. After 8 days, they cap the cells to allow the larvae to develop. And this is very typical, I'd say, of a brood frame. And then on the outer cells here, if you were to look under good lighting conditions, you'd probably see young eggs. And then the black, darker material in these cells out here is pollen, and then you always get then a band of stores then, so honey on the outer edge. And this is the most efficient way of them producing young larvae. So they say when the eggs hatch out into larvae, they get fed copious amounts of brood food, which is a mixture of pollen and honey for the first few days. And so it's the most efficient way for these worker bees to feed them, by having everything close at hand. Bees are very clever. They've over the millennia they've developed the most efficient ways of doing every single job in the colony. And then above the brood box then is something called the queen excluder. And as again, as the name says in the box, it's there to stop the queen moving up into the boxes above. It's of a size, if you look at the right-hand picture, the gaps between these little metal strips are big enough to allow a worker bee to move up, to travel up into the boxes above. but they're small enough then to stop the queen going up. In some countries in the world, they don't use queen excluders, and they don't mind finding the odd bit of larvae in amongst their honey. But in this country, we tend to use queen excluders to stop the queen going up into the boxes above, which is where they keep the honey. And so, talking of which, we keep the honey is stored in boxes called supers. These are about half the size, half the depth, if you see on the picture on the left, than the brood box. And that's purely because of the weight. When a super is full of honey, it's quite heavy. It's at least 20 kilos, 40 pounds. And so if you imagine you've got four, or luckily if you have a really good year, you might have 4 of these stacked one above each other, you know, and they can be like shoulder height. It can be quite heavy to lift. And this is one of the advantages we have as a couple. We always generally beekeep together. And so when they become full of honey and quite heavy, you know, we lift them off together, you know, saving our backs. Yes, and so as I say, you can have several of these boxes above, and you can have, in some cases, you can have more than one brood box, but that's, as I say, it's a more advanced form of beekeeping. And then above that, then in this case, you have the crown board, and the crown board there is for a few different jobs. You can use it for you know, there's various feeders which you can put above these holes here to allow the bees access to feeders. You can use it for clearing bees. What we mean by clearing bees is when you come to take your supers away and to take your honey off, you need to remove all the bees, and you can put one-way doors in these little holes. And then overnight, all the bees will leave the top boxes down to the boxes below, but they won't be able to get back. So that's what we mean by clearing bees. And also, most importantly, I heard mentioned before about propolis being a very sticky substance. Well, if you didn't have propolis, if you didn't have the crown board, they would propolize the roof down, and it would be virtually impossible to get it off. So they tend not to come up into this top box much at all. So they tend not to propolize this top crown board, to the roof, and so it becomes quite. It's easy then just to lift it off. The other boxes you will have to prise open with something called a hive tool. I'll come on to that in a minute. And then on top then, obviously, you have the roof. And this is probably one of the most essential bits of equipment. It needs to obviously be watertight, particularly in West Wales. It needs to be put on correctly. I think you heard us all laughing about one of our members who had his roof not on correctly, and other bees came and stole the honey from him. And also, there are holes on the side with mesh coverings, and this allows the ventilation. So you have the mesh floor at the bottom, holes in the top of the roof, and that allows airflow to flow around, removing any moisture away. And then in winter months in particular, or if you've got a polystyrene hive, you tend to strap the hives down. So the roof tends to be a little bit more robust, because then you can strap quite tightly against the stands. And then the frames. So obviously you have removable frames inside the hive, and the frames come flat packed. You can have them buy them ready-made. It's a very expensive way of buying frames. I don't know anybody who does it. Most people make up their frames, and when we have our practical sessions, we always have a session where I show you how to make a frame up, because there is a correct way of doing it, which makes life a lot easier then when you come to reuse the frames. And you also, I'll say at this point as well, you can buy your equipment flat packed, and it's often the cheapest way of doing buying bee equipment is to buy your whole hive flat packed. It's not difficult if you've got a little bit of DIY skills to make your equipment. And some of the companies, one in particular, Thorns, they've developed some really good YouTube videos to watch. And I say we normally have a practical session. I can easily come and show people how to make up hives as well. So fundamentally, the frames are the same. You know, the top bars are the same, and the bottom bars. The side bars aren't. You can have square-ended sides, which are generally used in the honey for the honey frames, because it's a technique of removing your cappings when you come to extract honey. It's very easy to run your knife along the edge of this flat frame. And then there's something called the Hoffman frame as well. And going back to bee space, we're trying to maintain that 7 millimeters by having Hoffman frame side frames side by side. It guarantees the correct bee space. So I wish we were told this when we first started to buy Hoffman frames. And it's by far the best way of doing it. There are other ways of making correct bee space by putting plastic spacers along the tops here, but that becomes very fiddly. I would just say buy Hoffman sidebars. And don't worry if you're not going to remember all this. You know, as I say, you know, when you join us and when you come to buy equipment, there's many of us on hand to help and to help you out, because it is very confusing at the start. And as I say, there was a correct way of making your frames up, and if you do it correctly, you should use 11 pins, and they're called GIMP pins. Don't buy some cheap nails thinking from Screwfix will do. Just buy the correct GIMP pins. You can buy them from the retailers, and it just makes life much easier. And you may think, oh, it's easy to make a frame up, but by putting the nails in the correct angles, it's very easy for you to prise them apart and to be able to reuse the frame. Because after a period of time, the comb here will become darkened and becomes quite dirty, and so you will remove the comb, but quite often you can reuse the frame. So it is well worth learning how to make a frame up properly. And so this is a photo of a typical apiary, really, and it's here really because I'd like to suggest to you that we all have this grand idea when we first start in beekeeping. We just have a hive at the bottom of our garden type like thing. But unfortunately, the way you have to manage your bees, mainly in particular to stop swarming. Swarming is a very complex topic, which you pick up over the first 3 or 4 years of keeping bees. You will have to split your colonies. And even on the first year, I suggest you buy extra equipment. You need to buy basically an extra hive, really, an extra brood box floor and roof to make life a lot simpler. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't cost that extra equipment in. And so it's a bit of a shock after you just had your bees, and after a couple of months they went to swarm and you realize I don't have enough equipment. And also then I want to suggest to you that after you've kept bees for a few years and you've developed your skills a bit further, that a nice number for a small hobbyist beekeeper, a nice number of colonies, is probably 3 to 4 colonies, because unfortunately naturally you will lose bees over the winter. Some winters people can suffer quite large losses, 75% quite easily. And if you only got one hive and you lose that bee due to no fault of your own, just the way things go with keeping bees throughout the winter, you've got no bees left, and so it becomes quite costly. You will have to buy yourself another colony next year. And I know lots of beekeepers have only kept one hive for the first few years and become quite disheartened that they kept losing the bees. they thought it was something they were doing, and it's not. It's something that naturally happens, and they've given up. Whereas if they'd had 3 or 4 colonies, you might lose half. Well, at least you've got then some material. If you've got a hive of bees, you can make increase the following year. So it's far cheaper to have a couple of colonies at least, to allow you that bit of insurance to increase the following year. And so, quite importantly, PPE. It's very topical at the moment. So obviously, you will need a bee suit. You can get full length bee suits and half jackets. I would suggest you get a full one. Beekeeping equipment is obviously very sticky. You've got the honey, you've got nectar, you've got propolis, which is unbelievably sticky. And your trousers and stuff can get very, very dirty. So having a full length bee suit is, to me, is quite important. And then you'll need some sort of gloves. I do know people who don't use gloves, but generally as beginners we're quite wary. And there's various types of gloves. I'll come on to gloves in a minute. And then footwear. You see some people will just use the boots or whatever. But if your bee suit doesn't, or they'll tuck their socks then into their trousers, but that's all that does is expose your ankles to the bees. And bees are quite, if they do get a bit grumpy with you for some reason, they're quite good at finding the most vulnerable places, and so they'll go for your ankles. So by having a pair of Wellingtons, a full-length bee suit which you tuck into your Wellingtons, and you tuck your gloves, you tuck your sleeves inside your gloves. And I should say bees have this tendency to land on you, and what they'll do is they crawl up. But if everything is tucked in, they can't crawl into your clothing. And if you've got a half bee suit and they crawl up your jeans, they can quite easily go under the bottom hem of your suit if there's a small gap. And next thing you've got a bee inside your suit, which is not desirable. So to me, a full-length bee suit is probably the way to go. Coming on to gloves. Gloves is, you think it would be quite, well, to me, gloves is quite an important consideration. As a beginner, you will probably you think you should go for the thicker glove, and the thicker gloves are made of goat skin. They're like a leather, well, they are leather. But unfortunately, the leather gloves, although they offer you protection from stings, they're not very dexterous. And so what you tend to do is you tend to squash the bees more, you aggravate them more, and so they tend to sting you more. Another option is to have disposable gloves. And this is what Linva uses. She uses like a nitrile glove. And obviously, it's only skin thick. And you think, oh, they'll sting me for that. And well, they will. But because you're so much more dexterous in your hand, you can feel the bees, you tend to be much gentler with them. And as you see here, Linva is marking the queen, and you'll never, ever be able to do that with a leather glove. It's just impossible. And then a middle ground is just a simple pair of marigolds, just a simple pair of washing up gloves. And this is what I tend to use. They're much cheaper, a couple of quid. They're disposable gloves you can throw away. Obviously, Linva tends to use them for one session. Like we've got 30 hives, she'll use them for the day and then throw them away. Marigolds you can wash and scrub really easily. But the leather gloves are quite hard to keep clean. So personally, I'd say forget about the leather gloves and go for the marigolds. Really, you'll be much more gentler with the bees, and they'll be happier. And if they're happier, you'll be a happy beekeeper as well. And then the next thing you need, which comes under PPE, is smoker. The smoker is obviously, you put material like cardboard or grass or wood shavings into it and light it. And the smoke then subdues the bees. And this is your main form of protection of keeping the bees quiet and less aggressive with you. Not that bees are aggressive anyway. If most bees are fine, you can open a hive and they'll be fine with you. But on occasions they can get, depending on the weather or the time of year, they can get a bit aggressive. So having a good smoker is important. And even though you only might think you only have a couple of hives, don't go for a small smoker. Try and get a really large one, because if you've got a large one, it's much easier to light, because you put the material into the bottom of the smoker, and then with long matches you light it. But also by having a large smoker, you produce cooler smoke, because the last thing you want to be doing is wafting over smoke which is really hot and got embers onto your bees, because again that upsets them. So a large smoker is definitely worthwhile. And as a beginner, naturally you'll be taking quite a bit of time to go through your hive because things are new to you. And the last thing you want is your smoker to be going out all the time. It's just much easier to have a large one, a large smoker really. And something like a smoker, you buy a good one, it'll be with you for years, for life really, if you look after it well. And then the other thing you'll need as well is a hive tool. And you may think, what's a hive tool? An old chisel will do or something like that. But please don't. Just buy yourself a good hive tool. Again, it'll be in your hands all the time, and it just becomes like your best mate. It's just constantly with you. And it's quite important to have a good hive tool rather than an old screwdriver or chisel, because in the top right photo, you can see they've got quite a large flange, and that's what you use to prise open the hives. As I say, the boxes can be propolis down, and it can become really hard to get open. And you literally have to crack them open. You hear a crack as the propolis gives way. And this is what's happening here in the bottom left. Linva's cracking open the hive. And Linva actually is one of the few people I know who uses two hive tools. So she uses something called a J hive tool as well, which you can see here she's using to lift up the frames out of the boxes. So as I say, get yourself a good hive tool. They're not that expensive. Then this one's made of stainless steel. And one habit you should get into is not to put it down anywhere, because if you put it down the floor, you'll lose it. And the last thing you want to do is lose your hive tool. Most bee suits have a little side pocket on the leg, which just fits in your hive tool. When you've got to do things double-handed, just get in the habit of putting it into your pocket. So it's a lesson you learn fairly quickly. And then moving on to other equipment which you might not think you're going to need in your first year, you'll certainly need some sort of feeders. Unfortunately, in some summers, the weather conditions get so bad you might have to feed the bees. If you've got a small colony, a small nucleus, you'll have to feed them then. And also when you come to take the honey off at the end of the year, you have to replace their stores, because obviously that's what they were going to use for the winter, to survive the winter. You have to give them a sugar solution for the winter. And so you have various types. So there's some contact feeders, which are these two in the middle. The cheapest contact feeder you can get is a large jam jar, and you just hammer in some nails to make some holes, and you fill it up with sugar solution, like this contact feeder here. You fill both of these up with sugar solution, and you turn them upside down onto the crown board. And do you remember I said the crown board had two holes in? Well, you'll put then the holes, the mesh or the holes above that hole, and then the bees can come up and they can drink the honey from there. And then you have frame feeders as well, which is the one on the left. And this container, you fill it up with fill it up with sugar solution, and it's got a piece of wood inside which floats on the sugar solution, and the bees basically climb down on the sides. Sides are ribbed so they can climb down the walls and side, They'll sit on the piece of wood and they'll drink the sugar solution from there. And the frame feeders are quite good because when you've got a small hive, you can actually small number of frames, you can actually put it inside the brood box next to the bees. So they're quite handy to have. And then these large jumbo feeders, as I say, once you take your stores off, the honey off, and you want to give them stores for next year, well, you don't want to be going back every day and filling up this bucket. It just becomes time consuming. So you will just give them literally 10 litres in one go, and they'll take that down maybe in like a day or two if they're really, really strong colony. And this again sits on top of the hive and top of the crown board with the roof on top. So you'll definitely need some sort of feeders. And then unfortunately, beekeepers tend not to like talking about costs, but unfortunately, it's no getting away from it. It is quite a costly hobby to start with. You can buy what they call startup kits, which is a complete hive from various companies. And out of wood, out of cedar, most hives are made out of cedar, and cedar is a wood which has natural preservatives, because you don't want to paint your hives with any wood preservatives and things, because that could be harmful to the bees. So a typical cost would be 170 to 220. Polystyrene hives tend to be cheaper, they tend to be 110. And then moving on, your bee suit, a half is usually about £50. A full bee suit, top of the range would be about 100, 110. Gloves, as I say, marigolds, £1.50, £2, whatever. And a smoker, as I say, please get consider getting a good size smoker, a good quality smoker, because it will last you for years. It's about 40, hive tool 10, and then feeders. Then the smaller type ones are about £5, and the large jumbo ones are 25. And then of course, you shouldn't forget your bees as well. So to buy a small nucleus of bees, which is about half a colony, 5 frames of bees, is typical around 160. If you were to go to the large retailers, it'd be more like 250. So, but you may be able to find somebody who's got swarms or who's downsizing. Often you will be able to get maybe get some equipment cheaper. You can also, I should say at this point, you can also buy the whole entire startup kit, which is a hive, suit, glove, smoker, feeders, a hive tool, and it's usually a few other incidentals thrown in. They're not usually the best quality, and if you were to buy all those together, I've been looking through the catalogues. There's various catalogues you can get as well. I'll come on to this in a minute. There's usually about 450 to 500, which is something similar, I suppose. But for a lot of people, it's quite easy to buy everything in one go. So where to buy? Well, there's many retailers. Most of them are online. There's no retailers locally, I'm afraid. You do have to travel. But another place where you can buy equipment is at honey shows and conventions, and they're quite good to go because they'll often have show specials where they have prices, much cheaper prices. And they'll also, at the shows as well, sell something called seconds. And quite often they'll just be beekeeping equipment, particularly frames and hives. They'll have so special prices, which just maybe have some cosmetic damage, or they might have, might have small cracks. Be careful when you go buying your seconds, if you're going to go for the seconds, because occasionally you will, you might get carried away and pick up, you think something's a good price, and you might go home and find that there's a particularly bad knot in a piece of wood and it falls out. So with your seconds, just go through the whole entire stack and try and pick out the best suit you can, really. And then second-hand equipment as well. You can buy equipment second hand. There are many beekeepers who, for various reasons, give up. Be they get ill health or elderly. But as I say here, you need to beware really when you're buying second-hand equipment. Unfortunately, with bees and colonies, there are various pests and diseases that prevail with them, and some of these pathogens are carried on equipment. And so you should always have in the back of your mind that second-hand bee equipment can carry pests and diseases. So I would say if you are going second-hand route, then ask people with more experience than yourself to maybe come with you, get some details of the person you are buying equipment from, because they may be known for people who aren't very on top of their disease control. And no matter what, when you do get your second-hand equipment, you should always clean and disinfect it, be it polystyrene second-hand or wood, because that's the only way to ensure that you're not carrying something to your new colony which you've bought, because the last thing you want to do is infect it with some disease. And also, when I'm talking about cleaning and disinfecting, it's also good to get into the habit of doing that on a regular basis. When you're taking equipment away from your colonies and at the end of the season, the first thing you should do is clean it. And this is an issue I have with polystyrene. I should say that we do have some polystyrene hives. Linva, and we could quite like to try things out, and so lots of people were going into polystyrene, so we bought a couple of polystyrene hives to see how we got on with them. And one of the issues with polystyrene is because it's to me it's a bit of a faff to disinfect it and clean it. You tend not to do it as well as a piece of wood, as just blow torching some wood. So but as I say, get in the habit of doing that every time. And talking of which, we always disinfect our hive tools. We've got out apiaries, we've got 6 out apiaries, and when between each visit, when I was revisiting each one, we'll clean and disinfect the gloves and a hive tool as well. So hopefully I haven't frightened you off too much by the costs in particular, but I should say that as a hobby, it's absolutely amazing. It takes over your whole life, and what starts out as being a small little wheelbarrow job soon becomes, well, not quite, soon becomes Linva. This is the picture on the right is what Linva would like to do full time. It's a struggle for me to try and keep her more to the left of the wheelbarrow. So, but anyway, any questions?
Thanks, Rob. That was really good. We haven't got any questions yet, and it's a fairly small group. So if people wanted to just raise anything verbally as opposed to using chat, then please do so.
Don't be shy, folks. Give us a question. Okay, I've got a question for you then. Of the beginner, of the people who join us tonight, anybody really keen to keep bees as soon as possible, or?
Well, since it's Anthony speaking. Since we started doing these courses, I've got somebody that's got 4 or 5 colonies on site, and once I've managed to sort myself a suit, I'll be able to help her running, doing bits and pieces, and getting the practical that unfortunately we're not able to do at the moment. Yes. That's all good for me.
And that's a very good way of starting bees, is trying to find a mentor to help, and something we try and do after our beekeeping beginners course. We'll once you get bees, we try and find somebody, a member, a quite experienced member close to where you live, just to be at hand, because I know it was like when we first started, we had a mentor, a very good mentor, who sold us our bees, and we'd quite often be like on the phone panicking, going, what's going on now, sort of thing. And that's perfectly natural. It's a really good way of starting, really.
Yeah, I found it really useful.
And talking of bee suits, I would definitely recommend a full bee suit. There are 2 types you can get. You can get like the boiler suit type, made of like material, or just recently now, last few years, there's like a vented bee suit, which is like a double skin suit with like a mesh, which some people use because they're cooler. I think you've got one, haven't you, Anne? A mesh suit.
Liz has sent me a couple of links to bee suits and all that. The ones you were saying seem to be cheaper than what she was showing me. Have you got a link or a catalogue that could be shared?
Well, you know, sort of, if you look at things like Maysmore sites, Maysmore or Thorns or bee equipment, but probably the best bee suits are BB Wear. Is it BB Wear?
Yeah, BB Wear is the ones that we use, and you know we've got on really well with them. Sheriffs are also really good, really high quality, and probably the upper end of the price bracket as well. But they are incredibly good quality.
I think she was saying that being members through the Montgomeryshire or whatever beekeeping, they'd organised some discounts. Is that something that Aberystwyth have managed to do, or?
Not on suits, no, we haven't done that.
No, we do it on things like jars and bee feed and some of the disease control things we use, but not on equipment like that. No.
I'm going to have to leave the meeting now. Actually, I've got something else occurring now. So thank you very much for that. That was much appreciated. I hope everybody else enjoyed it as much as I did. And I'll speak to you all again next time, hopefully.
Good. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Hi, Rob. I just had a question. It's Bryn here. Is this the final one in the beginners series or not? I'm not too sure.
No, I think there's one in a month's time then. And it's on honey extraction and honey processing, and a bit about taking your bees into the winter and things like that. Yeah, just to make you.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Well, I don't live anywhere near Aberystwyth, and I'm actually a member of my local association here, but my dad and family live in Taliesin.
Okay.
So Bill Regan, I think, used to be part of the association. But I've been joining the beginners beekeeping course from my local association in Kingston, and this one as well. And this one's far superior. So thank you very much.
Well,
that's nice to hear. Thank you.
It's been really good.
You'll just have to join us then, won't you?
Well, that's another question I had. You know, even though I'm not there, could I join as an associate member or something like that?
Yeah.
I can go on the website and join through there, can I?
You can, yes.
I don't think you'll be able to do it through our website. If you contact Anne, you must know Anne.
Yeah. Okay.
Contact Anne, and she'll sort it out. Yeah.
Okay, I'll do that.
I can put you in touch if need be.
And unfortunately, if this COVID crisis carries on for the foreseeable future, I think all our meetings might be like this. So, and so as a member, you can join the other meetings as well. Yeah. So,
Great. Thank you.
And I should say that in a fortnight's time, we've got a guest speaker from Stafford. A really well-known beekeeper is going to give us a talk about preparing your bees for the winter, and there's quite a lot of I'm not going to give the talk away, so, but a bee that goes through the winter is not the same as a bee that a summer bee.
Yeah. Okay, great, thank you.
Hi, can I ask about bee stings? Do you? Yeah, because I was stung by a bee the other day, and I've not been stung. I can't remember ever being stung, and I don't know whether it was a bad reaction, whether it's a average reaction. So what would you say would be an average reaction to a bee sting?
Well,
I mean, I've been stung by a wasp twice, but not in adulthood, and I don't do very well with insect bites generally. So my finger swelled up, and it was very painful for a few days, and it's gone now, so it was fine. But is that, would I expect that each time? Does it get less, or don't you know? I mean,
just mentioned they shouldn't be. I'm going to hand over to you. I've been ousted from my own talk.
So Firstly, wasp stings are different to bee stings.
Yeah.
Some people can react to a wasp, but not to a bee.
Yeah.
And also, what you've had sounds like a relatively mild reaction.
Yeah.
In that you've had some localized swelling.
Yeah.
And next time you get stung, you may well find that the reaction is less severe or more severe.
Yeah.
So it's really impossible to predict that.
Yeah.
It depends. It's a very individual thing. So the type of reaction that I get when I get stung is intense pain for about 30
Yeah.
seconds.
Yeah.
And then nothing more than a little bit of itching in the site where I was stung, and that may last for a day or so.
Mm.
But that's not to say I can be completely complacent about it. And there are occasions when people who've been beekeeping for many, many years suddenly develop a severe reaction. And clearly the most severe reaction is anaphylaxis, and
Yeah.
that's obviously a life-threatening situation. So if you, the best advice really is don't beekeep alone.
No, I'm probably going to be Ian's assistant, I think. I'll be wearing the thick gloves.
Yeah.
That's exactly how we do it. Basically, there's become, I'm just the assistant, and it works really well. It works well working as a pair. Because one thing I should say is, if any of you are thinking of keeping bees as a family or whatever, or as a couple of friends, keeping bees as a committee doesn't work. You just need one person to do the management, to make decisions, and it by all means help out. But I was going to say as well, you should never ever, certainly as a beginner, never ever go to your bees alone until you know how you're going to react to your stings. And after that, then you should definitely let people know where you're going. And the like, so yeah. But it depends on your site as well, because sometimes you can have virtually nothing. But I occasionally have, your finger will swell up for 12 hours, whatever.
Yeah. If I get stung on my fingers, it tends to be very, very mild. If I get stung in some soft tissue, for example, like under your arm here, then it tends to swell more because it's got more room to swell, if you see what I mean. So they are quite variable. The thing to be really careful of is if you get multiple stings at the same time. So if, for example, the hive is a little bit grumpy and you end up with, as Rob mentioned, wearing Wellington boots so you don't get stung around your ankle. They don't like smelly feet. So if you've got trainers on and they can smell your feet, you'll quite often get stings around your ankles. And if you get multiple stings, that's when you need to be careful. And if I ever get multiple stings, it's rare, but if I ever get multiple stings, I will always say to Rob, I've been stung more than once today. Keep an eye on me. And then, he knows, what to look out for. And if, he suspected that there was any, change, and I reacted differently for some reason, then he knows, just get me to A&E. So, it all sounds a little bit melodramatic.
Yeah.
But, you do have to be sensible and cautious with these things because, just because I don't react to stings at the moment doesn't mean that will always be the case. And I have got some friends who, have been beekeeping for many years and have had to go through desensitization. You can go through a program of desensitization to bee venom. To be able to continue keeping bees.
Okay.
But
right.
I say it's slightly counterintuitive. Like you think a thicker glove will, especially if you're going to be keeping as a pair and you've got a thicker glove and you squash more bees, it might be your husband who gets stung more because he's got the thinner glove. So actually, I think a marigold, or you can get some slightly thicker latex glove, marigold type gloves is best because it gives you that dexterity and a bit of protection as well, and you tend to squash less bees with a more dexterous glove.
I use marigolds, but because my hands get so hot in them, I put very thin cotton gloves underneath, and the other day I had a grumpy colony, and one tried to sting me on my finger, but because I'd got another layer, the sting didn't go through, and so it didn't actually penetrate the cotton gloves. And although when you take the gloves off, the cotton gloves are soaking wet as well, it's not quite so uncomfortable as marigolds, which do get really, really hot and nasty.
That's a good idea.
Mm.
Well, good then. If there's no more questions. Anyway,
Very good.
you know where we are. So if you just by all means just get in contact with the club if you never want anything. So, and we'd love to see you in some of our meetings again.
Well, thanks very much for your time. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.